All right, let's dive into this list you sent me, the top 10 craziest people in music.
Yeah, this one's pretty wild.
It definitely got my attention, and I mean, it makes you think, what is it about music that seems to attract, I don't know, bigger than life personalities or maybe even a little bit of chaos?
I think that's what's so interesting about this list. It's not just a ranking, it's kind of a look at what we even mean by crazy in the context of music.
Right, like, is it just about outrageous behavior or is there something deeper going on?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, you've got some names on here that are infamous for their antics. Folks like G.G. Allen, Ozzy Osbourne.
Oh, yeah, those are household names when it comes to rock and roll mayhem.
Exactly. But then you've also got artists like Kurt Cobain, whose craziness was more internal, tied to their personal struggles and demons.
It's a good point. Like, there's a whole spectrum here from the shocking to the tragic.
And everything in between.
So, how do we even begin to unpack all of this? Where do we start?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at the list as a kind of a timeline, starting with some of the earlier pioneers of musical mayhem and then tracing it through to more recent examples.
Okay, that makes sense. So, who are we kicking things off with?
Well, we've got to start with the king of shock rock himself, G.G. Allen.
Oh, boy. Where do we even begin with him?
He was, let's just say he was committed to his art.
That's one way to put it.
I mean, this is a guy who is known for, well, pretty much anything you could imagine on stage and then some.
We're talking self mutilation, bodily fluids, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, he was notorious for pushing the boundaries of decency and then just obliterating them.
It's intense, to say the least. And I mean, some people saw it as pure performance art, a way to like confront taboos and societal norms.
There's definitely an element of transgression there, right? Like he's deliberately trying to provoke a reaction, to get under people's skin.
It makes you wonder, though, was it all an act or was there genuine mental instability at play?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that we'll probably never have a definitive answer to.
But I think it speaks to this idea that there's often a fine line between genius and madness, especially in the world of music.
Yeah, and that line can get really blurry really fast.
So G.G. Allen, he sets the bar pretty high or low, depending on how you look at it, for musical mayhem.
He definitely set a precedent, and you can see his influence in a lot of artists who came after him.
So who else is on this list that kind of follows in his footsteps?
Well, someone who took a very different approach to craziness but was no less impactful was Kurt Cobain.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure, and his story is ultimately a tragic one.
Absolutely, and I think his craziness stemmed from a much different place than someone like G.G. Allen.
Right, like Allen was all about outward shock and provocation, whereas Cobain's struggles were more internal, more tied to his own personal demons.
His music was raw and emotional, and it spoke to a generation of kids who felt like outsiders, who were struggling with their own pain and alienation.
It's interesting because, in a way, both Allen and Cobain were rebels. They were both challenging the status quo, but they did it in completely different ways.
Exactly, and I think that highlights the diversity of craziness
Yeah.
that we see on this list.
And it reminds us that it's not always about being loud and outrageous. Sometimes the quietest voices can be the most crazy in their own way.
And their impact can be just as profound, if not more so.
So we've got Gigi Allen, the embodiment of shock rock, and Kurt Cobain, the tortured artist, both pushing boundaries but in very different directions.
And those are just two examples on this list of 10.
There's a lot more ground to cover.
We've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I'm already starting to see how complex this whole idea of craziness in music really is.
It's not a simple concept, and it's something that's been debated for decades.
So where do we go from here? Who else is waiting in the wings on this list of musical mayhem?
Well, let's move on to someone who embraced the crazy label and turned it into a career. Ozzy Osbourne,
Now we're talking the Prince of Darkness himself.
the one and only, and his stories are legendary.
I mean, the bat-biting incident alone is enough to secure his place in the Hall of Fame of rock and roll craziness.
That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. We could spend hours talking about Ozzy's antics.
From snorting a line of ants to, well, let's just say he wasn't always kind to hotel rooms.
He definitely lived up to his reputation, but I think there's more to Ozzy than just the outrageous behavior.
Yeah, underneath all the craziness, he's a talented musician with a powerful voice and a knack for writing catchy tunes.
And he's also got a surprisingly good sense of humor about himself.
He's definitely learned to embrace the persona, and it's become part of his brand.
It's almost like he's turned craziness into a superpower.
And his fans love him for it.
Absolutely, they wouldn't have it any other way.
So Ozzy's a great example of how craziness can be used to create a larger-than-life persona, and it can actually work to an artist's advantage.
It can definitely be a powerful tool, but it's not always a guarantee of success, and it can come with a price.
Yeah, I mean, Ozzy's had his share of struggles with addiction and personal demons.
It's a reminder that even the most outrageous personalities are still human beings with their own vulnerabilities and complexities.
So we've gone from Gigi Allen's deliberate provocation to Kurt Cobain's inner turmoil to Ozzy Osbourne's larger-than-life antics.
It's a wild ride so far.
And we're only halfway through the list.
There's so much more to explore, and it gets even more interesting as we go along.
All right, I'm ready for the next dose of musical mayhem. Who's up next on our list?
Let's talk about someone who took shock rock to a whole other level. Marilyn Manson.
Yes, the self-proclaimed Antichrist superstar.
He's definitely someone who knows how to push buttons and challenge conventional norms.
I mean, his stage shows are legendary, full of disturbing imagery, religious symbolism, and just a general sense of unease.
He's a master of creating a dark and unsettling atmosphere, and his music reflects that.
It's heavy, it's aggressive, and it's definitely not for everyone.
He's not trying to appeal to the masses. He's deliberately courting controversy.
And he's been incredibly successful at it. I mean, love him or hate him, you can't deny his impact on music and popular culture.
He's definitely made a name for himself, and he's provoked a lot of conversation about censorship, artistic freedom, and the limits of what's acceptable in entertainment.
But I think it's also important to note that there's a lot of substance beneath the shock value.
Yeah, he's a thoughtful and intelligent guy, and his music is often more complex than people give it credit for.
He's not just about shock for shock's sake. There's a message there, a critique of society, and a desire to make people think.
He's definitely challenging us to confront our own discomfort, our own hypocrisy, and our own fears.
So Marilyn Manson, he's another example of how craziness can be used to create a powerful persona and deliver a message, even if it's a message that makes people uncomfortable.
He's not afraid to make people squirm, and that's part of what makes him so fascinating.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground, from the outrageous to the tragic, and now we're starting to delve into the truly disturbing.
And that's where things get really complicated, because we're not just talking about stage antics or controversial lyrics anymore.
We're talking about artists whose craziness has manifested in real-life violence and criminal activity.
And that forces us to confront some really difficult questions about the relationship between art and morality.
Yeah, like, can we separate the art from the artist when the artist has committed heinous acts?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
And I think it's a question that's particularly relevant in the context of this list because we're dealing with some extreme cases.
Who's the first artist we're going to tackle in this realm of craziness that crosses the line into criminality?
Well, there's one name that stands out for its sheer darkness: Varg Vikernes.
Ah, yes, the black metal musician who was convicted of arson and murder.
His story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the craziness we see in music isn't just an act, it can have very real and devastating consequences.
And it raises a whole host of ethical questions about how we engage with art that's created by someone who's committed such horrific acts.
Like, can we still listen to his music and appreciate it without condoning his actions?
It's a tough question, and I think it's one that each listener has to grapple with on their own.
There's no right or wrong answer, but it's important to have the conversation.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to remember that Vikernes' case is not an isolated incident.
Unfortunately, there are other examples on this list of musicians who've crossed that line from art to crime.
And each case presents its own unique set of challenges and questions.
So we're moving from the realm of shock and awe into a much darker territory.
It's a reminder that craziness can have many faces, and some of those faces are far more disturbing than others.
And it challenges us to think critically about our own relationship with music and the artists who create it.
It's not always easy, but it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely, and I think it's just the beginning of a much larger discussion about the role of art in society, the nature of creativity, and the complexities of the human psyche.
Well said, and it's a discussion that I'm sure we'll be revisiting as we continue to explore this list.
All right, so we've got Gigi Allen, Kurt Cobain, Ozzy Osbourne, Marilyn Manson, and now Varg Vikernes.
Quite the lineup so far.
A real rogues gallery of musical mayhem.
And there's still more to come.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but who's next on our list of crazy musicians?
Let's talk about someone whose story is both incredibly talented and incredibly tragic. Jim Gordon.
Oh, the drummer, right? I know the name.
Yeah, he was a phenomenal drummer, played with some of the biggest names in music.
I think I read somewhere that he played on Lila.
You're exactly right. He co-wrote the piano coda for that song, one of the most iconic pieces of music ever recorded.
Wow, so he was clearly a brilliant musician.
No doubt about it, but his story takes a very dark turn.
Yeah, I remember hearing something about him having mental health issues.
He suffered from schizophrenia, and unfortunately, he never received proper treatment.
And that ultimately led to a terrible tragedy.
Sadly, yes, he ended up killing his own mother during a psychotic episode.
That's heartbreaking, and it really highlights the importance of mental health awareness and support, especially in the often demanding world of music.
Absolutely. The music industry can be a very challenging environment with immense pressure to perform, constant touring, and a culture that sometimes glorifies substance abuse.
It's a recipe for disaster for anyone struggling with mental health challenges.
And Jim Gordon's story is a stark reminder of that.
So his craziness wasn't about shocking stage antics or even criminal intent. It was a tragic manifestation of a serious mental illness.
It's a completely different kind of craziness than what we've seen with some of the other artists on this list.
But it's no less impactful, and it raises a whole other set of questions about how we treat mental illness and how we support artists who are struggling.
It's a conversation that needs to be had, and it's one that we need to keep having.
So Jim Gordon, a brilliant musician whose life was cut short by tragedy, a reminder that craziness can take many forms, and sometimes it's not about outward chaos, but about the silent struggles happening within.
And it's a reminder that we need to be more compassionate and understanding when it comes to mental health issues.
Absolutely, and we need to create a more supportive environment for artists who are dealing with these challenges.
It's not just about celebrating the music, it's about caring for the people who create it.
Well said, and it's a message that I think is particularly relevant in the context of this list, where we're exploring the extremes of human behavior in the music industry.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from the shocking to the tragic, and we've seen how craziness can manifest in many different ways.
And we're not done yet. There are still a few more names on this list.
And each one presents its own unique story and its own set of questions.
All right, I'm ready for the next chapter in our deep dive into musical mayhem. Who else is waiting in the wings?
Well, let's talk about someone whose case is incredibly disturbing and raises some very difficult questions about accountability and the consequences of fame. Ian Watkins.
Oh yeah, the lead singer of Lost Prophets. His story is just horrific.
There's no other way to describe it. The crimes he committed were truly monstrous.
It's hard to even comprehend how someone could do the things he did.
It's a dark and disturbing chapter in the history of music, and it's a stark reminder that the craziness we often associate with musicians can sometimes mask something far more sinister.
It's a case where the line between art and morality is completely obliterated.
There's no way to separate the two. There's no way to excuse his actions.
It's a chilling reminder that we can't romanticize or glamorize craziness without acknowledging the potential for darkness and harm.
And it raises questions about the role of the music industry, the media, and even the fans in enabling and perpetuating this kind of behavior.
Like, were there warning signs that were ignored? Were people afraid to speak up?
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. It's a conversation that we need to have.
Absolutely, and we need to hold people accountable for their actions regardless of their fame or status.
So Ian Watkins, a case that forces us to confront the darkest aspects of craziness and the devastating consequences that can result.
It's a sobering reminder that not all craziness is harmless fun, and sometimes it can have truly horrific implications.
And it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant and proactive in protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit and abuse them.
Well said, and it's a message that I think resonates even more strongly in the context of this list, where we're exploring the extremes of human behavior in the music industry.
So we've gone from shock rock to tortured artists, from larger-than-life antics to tragic mental illness, and now we've entered the realm of true crime.
It's a journey that's taken us to some very dark places.
But it's also a journey that's forced us to confront some important truths about the nature of creativity, the complexities of the human psyche, and the power of music to both inspire and destroy.
And we're not done yet. There's still more to explore in this list.
We've only just begun to scratch the surface of what it means to be crazy in the world of music.
All right, I'm ready for the next chapter. Who else is waiting to be unveiled on our list of musical mayhem?
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about someone whose craziness is more about pushing boundaries and challenging conventions. Justin Bieber.
Oh, interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily thought of him for this list, but now that you mention it, he's definitely had his share of controversial moments.
Yeah, he's been no stranger to the tabloids, and he's definitely done some things that have raised eyebrows.
From egging his neighbor's house to peeing in a mop bucket.
He's had his share of youthful indiscretions, But I think it's important to remember that he was thrust into the spotlight at a very young age.
Yeah, he was basically a kid when he became a global superstar.
And that kind of pressure and scrutiny can take a toll on anyone, especially someone who's still figuring out who they are.
It's easy to judge from the outside, but it's hard to imagine what it's like to live your life under that kind of microscope.
And I think in Bieber's case, his craziness has been more about rebellion and a desire to break free from the constraints of his image.
Like he's trying to assert his own individuality and break away from the squeaky clean pop star mold.
Exactly, and that can sometimes manifest in ways that aren't always pretty.
But I think it's also worth noting that he's matured a lot in recent years.
He's definitely grown up, and he seems to be in a much better place now.
So maybe his craziness was just a phase, a part of his journey toward finding himself.
It's possible, and I think it's a reminder that we shouldn't be too quick to judge, especially when it comes to young artists who are still evolving.
So Justin Bieber, a pop star who's had his share of ups and downs, but whose craziness seems to be more about rebellion and a desire to break free from expectations than anything truly malicious.
And it raises some interesting questions about the role of the media and the public in shaping the perception of these young stars.
Yeah, like, do we give them enough space to grow and make mistakes?
It's a tough balance because they're in the public eye, but they're also human beings.
So it's a reminder that we need to be more compassionate and understanding, even when it comes to those who seem to have it all.
Absolutely. And we need to be mindful of the power dynamics at play, especially when it comes to young artists who are still finding their way.
Well said, and I think it's an important point to keep in mind as we continue to explore this list.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from the shocking to the tragic, from the outrageous to the rebellious, and we've seen how craziness can manifest in so many different ways.
And we're still not done yet. There are a few more names on this list that I'm eager to discuss.
And each one will bring its own unique perspective to this ongoing exploration of what it means to be crazy in the world of music.
All right, I'm ready for the next chapter. Who's up next on our list of musical mayhem?
Let's dive into the world of hip-hop and talk about someone whose lyrics have sparked endless debates about free speech and artistic expression. Eminem.
Oh, yeah, he's definitely a controversial figure, but also a hugely successful and influential one.
There's no doubt about that. He's one of the best-selling music artists of all time, and his impact on hip-hop is undeniable.
But his music has also been accused of being misogynistic, homophobic, and violent.
There's definitely a lot of anger and aggression in his lyrics, and he's not afraid to push buttons.
And that's led to a lot of backlash, with some people calling for his music to be censored.
But others defend him as a master storyteller who's simply reflecting the realities of his upbringing and the world around him.
And they argue that his music is a form of social commentary, even if it's uncomfortable to hear.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer.
But I think it's important to have the conversation and to grapple with the questions that his music raises.
Absolutely, because it's not just about Eminem. It's about the larger issue of artistic freedom and the limits of what's acceptable in music.
So Eminem, a rapper whose craziness lies in his willingness to say the unsayable, to challenge norms and provoke reactions.
And it's a reminder that music can be a powerful tool for both expression and provocation.
And it can force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and society.
And it's up to each listener to decide where they draw the line between art and offense.
Well said, and I think that's a good place to leave this conversation for now.
We've covered a lot of ground, and we've only scratched the surface of what it means to be crazy in the world of music.
But we've seen how craziness can manifest in so many different ways, from shocking stage antics to tragic mental illness, from outrageous behavior to criminal acts.
And we've seen how it can both inspire and destroy, elevate and degrade.
And I think the most important takeaway is that it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that we need to keep having.
Well said, and I'm looking forward to continuing this exploration in our next episode.
Until then, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep embracing the wild and wonderful world of music.
It's crazy to think that some of the craziness we're talking about isn't just like, wild behavior or whatever, but sometimes it's like baked into the music itself, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, for sure. The music itself could be super controversial, like challenging norms and pushing boundaries. And I mean, some people just, they can't handle it.
Right, it's like too much for them.
Yeah.
And we were talking about Eminem earlier, and I think he's a great example of that. Like, his lyrics, they've caused so much debate over the years about misogyny, homophobia, violence, you name it. People have strong opinions.
It's like, is it art? Is it offensive? Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. It's a really blurry line.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, Eminem, he's such a fascinating case study because his music is raw, it's aggressive, and he's clearly, like, intentionally provocative.
Yeah, he's not shying away from anything.
Not at all, and he taps into this, like, anger and frustration, and it obviously resonates with a lot of people.
Especially young men.
Definitely.
But it's interesting how, like, our interpretation of his music can be so different depending on who we are, what our experiences are.
Totally. He's a polarizing figure for sure.
Yeah. And then on a completely different level, there's Johnny Rebel, whose music is just like straight up racist. It's really hard to listen to.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, Johnny Rebel's music, it's a reminder of just how dark artistic expression can get.
It's like beyond eccentric, beyond transgressive. It's just hateful.
Yeah, and it makes you think about these big questions like, can you separate the art from the artist? Or is there a point where it's just too much?
Like, what's the responsibility of the artist?
Right, like where's the line between free speech and hate speech?
Exactly. It's a tough conversation to have.
It is, but it's an important one.
And I think it's a conversation that keeps coming up around music, throughout history.
Oh yeah, I mean, think about the controversies over Elvis's hips or punk rock or even like early hip hop. People were freaking out.
People are always afraid of something new, something that challenges the way things are.
Exactly. Music has always been a way to push back against the status quo, to make people think differently.
And sometimes that can be really uncomfortable, especially for those in power.
Definitely. But I think that's also what makes music so powerful. It can be a force for change, for good or for bad.
It's a double-edged sword.
For sure.
So we've got Eminem pushing boundaries with his lyrics and Johnny Rebel using music to spread hate, but it's not all doom and gloom.
Definitely not. I mean, there are artists on this list who are crazy in a more positive way, like pushing creative boundaries, breaking conventions.
Like Nina Hagen, she's someone who comes to mind with her like avant-garde style and those incredible vocals.
She's amazing, so unique, not afraid to be different.
And her music still sounds so fresh. Even today, she was ahead of her time.
Totally. She embraced her craziness and turned it into something really special.
And it's interesting because she's in the newcomers section of this list, which makes me think maybe our definition of crazy in music is changing, evolving.
I think you're right. Like what was considered shocking or outrageous in the past might be totally normal now.
And vice versa, right?
Yeah.
What's considered tame now might have been wild back in the day.
Exactly. It's all relative.
Speaking of newcomers, there's also Ike Turner on the list. And that's a really complicated one.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he's a pioneer of rock and roll, no doubt. But his history of abuse is just awful.
It's like, how do you reconcile the amazing music with the terrible things he did?
Right. Can you separate the art from the artist in that case?
I don't know. It's a tough question.
I think it's a personal choice, Some people can compartmentalize, others can't.
Yeah, it's about what you're comfortable with.
Exactly. And I think it's okay to have different perspectives on that.
So coming back to this idea of craziness in music, it seems like it can be so many things: rebellious, innovative, tragic, even criminal.
Yeah, the whole spectrum.
And the impact of that craziness can be just as varied. It can inspire, provoke, disturb, even destroy.
Powerful stuff.
It really makes you think about the power of music, how it intersects with our lives in these really profound ways.
For sure. And I think this list is making us question what craziness even means in this context.
Like, what do we find fascinating? What do we find disturbing, and why?
It's all about perspective, I guess.
And maybe the biggest question of all is, how does all this craziness shape the music itself?
And how does it affect the way we experience it?
Those are questions I don't think we can fully answer, but it's definitely worth exploring.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning of that exploration.
Yeah, there's so much more to unpack here.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion so far, and I can't wait to see what other insights we uncover as we continue.
Me too. This is getting really interesting.
It is, isn't it? I wonder what other musicians come to mind for you when you think about craziness in music, beyond this list. We'd love to hear from our listeners.
So we've made it to the end of our list, our top 10 craziest people in music, and wow, what a ride.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through the wild side of the music world.
It really has. I mean, we've talked about artists whose craziness showed up in all these different ways, from like the crazy stuff they did on stage to the dark stuff they did in their real lives, and even like some really heartbreaking stories of mental illness.
Yeah. And it just goes to show, I think, that craziness, it's not just one thing. It's this huge spectrum.
Right. And what might seem crazy to one person might be totally normal to someone else, or even like celebrated in a different time or
For
place.
sure. It's all relative.
And I think that's what makes this whole topic so interesting, right? It's not just about pointing fingers and saying, oh, that person's crazy. It's about trying to understand, like, what drives people to these extremes and how does that craziness influence their music?
Exactly. And how does it affect us as listeners?
Like, are we drawn to that craziness? Do we find it exciting or disturbing or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, when does it cross the line?
Mm.
When does it stop being entertaining and start being harmful?
That's a tough question, and I don't know if there's an easy answer, but I think it's something we have to think about as we engage with music and with the artists who create it.
Especially when you consider some of the really dark stories we've talked about, like,
Yeah.
the violence and the abuse.
Right. Those cases are a reminder that craziness can have some really serious consequences, not just for the artist, but for the people around them.
And I think it's important to remember that we as listeners, we have a role to play too. You
Yeah.
know, we can't just blindly support artists without considering their actions and the impact they have.
It's about being informed, being critical, and being willing to hold people accountable.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that the music industry, it's not always a glamorous and happy place. There's a lot of darkness there too.
Yeah, and sometimes that darkness seeps into the music itself.
For sure. But I think that's also what makes music so powerful, right? It can reflect the full spectrum of human experience, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
And maybe that's what draws us to it, that rawness, that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's like we need that darkness to appreciate the light.
Exactly. And maybe we need a little bit of that craziness to shake things up, to challenge the status quo, to make us think differently.
To remind us that there's more to life than just the ordinary, the mundane.
That there's beauty in the unexpected, in the unpredictable, even in the chaos.
And that maybe, just maybe, there's a little bit of craziness in all of us.
Maybe that's what connects us to the music, to the artists, to this whole wild and wonderful world.
And maybe that's a good thing. As long as we're aware of the risks and we're careful not to romanticize the darkness.
I think you're right. It's about finding that balance between appreciating the art and holding the artist accountable, between embracing the craziness and staying grounded in reality.
A lifelong journey, I guess, navigating this crazy world of music.
It is, but it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. And thanks to everyone for joining us on this particular leg of the journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening to our deep dive into the top 10 craziest people in music. It's been a wild ride.
It has, and we hope you've enjoyed it.
And maybe it's even given you something to think about, something to chew on.
Because at the end of the day, that's what music is all about, right?
Hmm.
Making us feel something, making us think, making us question.
So keep listening, keep exploring, and keep embracing that little bit of craziness in yourself because you never know where it might lead you.
Well, who knows? Maybe we'll see you on the next deep dive into the wild world of music.